The rain didn't just fall. It hammered the asphalt of the 4th Street Bridge, turning the night into a blurred watercolor of neon and gray. To the commuters rushing home to warm houses, the water was an inconvenience. To Caleb Miller, it was an enemy. Caleb was 20 years old, though his eyes held the weary depth of a man twice that age. He was 150 pounds of wiry muscle and bad luck, shivering inside a hoodie that had ceased to offer warmth hours ago. He was invisible. People looked through him, not at him. But invisibility ended the moment the black SUV lost traction. It happened in a heartbeat. A screech of rubber fighting hydroplane physics, the sickening crunch of metal shearing through the rusted guardrail, and then silence. The massive vehicle didn't just crash. It plummeted into the churning, freezing darkness of the river below. Physics said survival was impossible. The freezing temperature of the water said anyone who went in would die. Caleb stood at the broken edge of the rail, looking down into the abyss. He saw the taillights sinking. He saw something else, too, a flash of a patch on the driver's shoulder as the car had flown past. A winged skull. The death's head. The man in that water wasn't just a driver. He was a sergeant-at-arms for the Hells Angels, a predator of the streets. Caleb knew he should walk away. He knew the police would blame him if he was found there, but Caleb didn't think. He didn't calculate. He dove. 3 hours before the crash, the city was already trying to kill Caleb. New York in late November is a cruel place, but it is especially cruel when you have no front door to lock against the wind. Caleb sat huddled under the concrete arch of the bridge, his knees pulled to his chest. He was trying to preserve body heat, a trick he'd learned during his last stint in a foster home that didn't believe in paying the heating bill. He checked his backpack. It was a ragged canvas thing, stained with grease and mud, but it contained his entire life. A spare pair of socks, a half-eaten protein bar he'd saved from a construction day labor gig 2 days ago, and his wallet. Inside the wallet was a laminated state ID, Caleb Miller, age 20. It was the only proof that he existed. "Move it along, rat." The voice cut through the sound of the rain like a serrated knife. Caleb stiffened. He didn't need to look up to know who it was. The heavy, measured crunch of tactical boots on gravel gave him away. Sergeant Vic. Caleb looked up slowly. The police cruiser was parked on the service road, its lights off, prowling like a shark. Vic stood over him, a flashlight beam hitting Caleb directly in the eyes. Vic was a thick-set man, his uniform straining at the gut, his face defined by a cruel, jagged jawline and eyes that lacked any trace of empathy. He was known among the homeless population as the Vulture. He didn't arrest people, he picked them apart. "I'm just resting, officer," Caleb said, his voice raspy. "I've got a job line up in the morning." "I don't care if you have a meeting with the mayor," Vic sneered. He kicked the sole of Caleb's boot. It wasn't a hard kick, just enough to show dominance, enough to dirty the only shoes Caleb owned. "This is my district. I keep it clean. You're trash, Miller, and trash goes in the bin." Vic leaned down, the smell of stale coffee and aggression rolling off him. "If I see you under this bridge when I circle back in 3 hours, I'm not going to ask you to move. I'm going to book you for vagrancy, resisting, and whatever else I can think of. Maybe I'll break those fingers so you can't work that job." Vic laughed, a dry, humorless sound, and walked back to his cruiser. Caleb watched him go, a cold knot of hatred tightening in his stomach. He wasn't a criminal. He had aged out of the foster system with nothing but the clothes on his back, and he had been clawing his way up the cliff of poverty 1 inch at a time. But men like Vic didn't see the struggle. They only saw a target. Caleb stood up, slinging his backpack over his shoulder. He couldn't stay here. He had to move. He began to walk along the pedestrian path of the bridge, the rain soaking through his jacket instantly. He was alone in the world, or so he thought. The storm intensified as midnight approached. The rain fell in sheets, blurring the city lights into streaks of red and gold. Caleb walked the bridge, head down, fighting the wind. Traffic was light. Sensible people were indoors. Only the desperate and the dangerous were out tonight. Then came the roar, It wasn't the high-pitched whine of a sport bike. It was the thunderous, earth-shaking rumble of an American V-twin engine, a Harley-Davidson modified for power and volume. Caleb looked up. A black SUV, an Escalade, was speeding alongside a motorcycle. They weren't racing. The SUV was driving aggressively, swerving, cutting the bike off. It looked like road rage or something worse. The biker was a giant of a man. Even from a distance, Caleb could see the silhouette was massive, broad shoulders clad in leather. The biker revved his engine, trying to pull away, but the SUV swerved hard into the motorcycle's lane. The biker had to make a choice, hit the SUV or hit the brakes. He chose the brakes. The motorcycle fishtailed on the slick pavement. The biker laid the bike down with expert precision, sparks flying like fireworks as the chrome ground against the asphalt. But the SUV driver panicked. He overcorrected, the heavy vehicle spinning out of control. It slammed into the guardrail right in front of Caleb. The sound was deafening, metal screaming against metal. The rusted bolts of the old bridge, neglected for decades, snapped like twigs. The SUV hung over the edge for a fraction of a second, teetering, before gravity claimed it. It fell 60 feet. Caleb rushed to the broken rail. Below, the river was a black, churning maw. The SUV hit the water with a sound like a cannon blast, sending a geyser of white water into the air. The headlights stayed on for a moment, illuminating the murky depths before the water swallowed them. The biker who had laid his bike down was scrambling up, limping, shouting into his radio. But he was too far away. He wouldn't make it in time. Caleb looked at the water. It was suicide. The current was strong, the temperature near freezing. "Let it go," a voice in his head whispered. "It's probably a drug dealer, a gangster, not your problem." But then Caleb remembered the feeling of suffocation. He remembered being locked in a closet by a foster father when he was 10. The panic, the darkness. He couldn't let a man drown in a metal coffin. Caleb dropped his backpack near the rail, his ID, his life, left on the wet pavement. He took a breath that tasted of ozone and rain, vaulted the broken rail, and dove. The shock of the water was like being hit by a sledgehammer. It was colder than Caleb could have imagined. It punched the air from his lungs and tightened his muscles instantly. The Hudson River in November was a tomb. For a moment, Caleb was paralyzed, suspended in the freezing blackness, disoriented by the impact. "Move." He kicked his legs, driving himself downward. The water was murky, filled with silt and debris, but the fading beams of the SUV's headlights acted as a beacon. The car was sinking fast, nose down, twisting in the current. Caleb swam harder. His clothes felt like lead weights dragging him down. He reached the driver's side door. The window was shattered, likely from the impact. He peered inside. The driver was slumped over the steering wheel, unconscious. Blood floated in the water like smoke, red turning to black in the dark. The man was enormous. He had a thick beard that floated in the water like seaweed, and he was wearing a leather vest, a cut. Caleb grabbed the vest to pull him, and that's when he saw it. The bottom rocker on the back of the vest, visible as the man floated forward. Panic flared in Caleb's chest. He knew who they were. Everyone knew who they were. The Big Red Machine. Outlaws. Violence on two wheels. If Caleb touched this man, if he failed to save him, would the club blame him? Would they hunt him down? The man shifted in the current, his head lolling back. He looked peaceful, unsuspecting of the death rushing into his lungs. "He's just a man," Caleb told himself. "Just a man drowning." Caleb reached through the broken window. He grabbed the front of the leather vest. He planted his feet against the door of the sinking car and pulled. Nothing happened. The man was stuck. The seatbelt was still locked tight across his massive chest, and the car was sinking deeper, the pressure building in Caleb's ears. Caleb's lungs were burning. He needed air. His vision was starting to spot. He had to surface. If he stayed, he would die with this stranger. No. Caleb reached into his pocket. He didn't have a knife, but he had a piece of sharpened scrap metal he used for work, a flattened, honed piece of steel he used to scrape paint. It was crude, but it was sharp. He slashed at the seatbelt. The water slowed his swing. He slashed again, harder, feeling the fabric give. The car groaned, settling into the riverbed mud. The water was pitch black now. Caleb slashed a third time, and the belt snapped. The giant man floated free of the seat, but he was dead weight. 280 pounds of muscle and soaked leather. Caleb grabbed the man's collar, kicked against the car roof with every ounce of strength he had left, and propelled them both toward the surface. Breaking the surface felt like being born. Caleb gasped, sucking in air that felt razor-sharp against his freezing throat. Beside him, the giant bobbed in the choppy waves, face down. "Hey!" Caleb sputtered, flipping the man over. "Wake up!" The man was limp. His skin was pale, his lips blue. Caleb looked at the shore. It was 50 yards away, against a strong current. It looked like a mile. Caleb hooked his arm under the biker's armpit, employing a cross-chest carry he'd learned at the YMCA pool years ago, in a life that felt like a dream. He began to kick. Every stroke was a battle. The biker, a man Caleb would later learn was called Tank, was heavy. Incredibly heavy. The waterlogged leather vest added another 20 pounds. Caleb's shoulder, the one he had dislocated in a fight a year ago, began to scream in protest. Kick. Pull. Kick. Pull. The current tried to drag them downriver, away from the bank and out toward the harbor. Caleb fought it with a grit born of a lifetime of struggle. He gritted his teeth so hard he felt a molar crack. "Don't you die on me," Caleb grunted, water splashing into his mouth. "You big son of a bitch, don't you die." His legs went numb. The cold was seeping into his core, slowing his heart. Hypothermia was knocking on the door. Finally, his boots scraped against mud. Caleb didn't have the strength to stand. He crawled, dragging the unconscious giant through the slime and garbage of the riverbank. He clawed at the wet earth, his fingernails tearing, pulling the massive biker inch by inch out of the water until they were both on the solid, rain-slicked concrete of the path under the bridge. Caleb collapsed, his chest heaving, his body trembling violently. But he couldn't rest. The man wasn't breathing. Caleb rolled onto his knees. He ripped the biker's vest open, popping the buttons. He placed his hands on the man's sternum, a chest as wide as a beer keg. Caleb began chest compressions. 1, 2, 3, 4. "Breathe!" Caleb shouted. He pinched the man's nose and breathed into his mouth. The taste of river water and tobacco. He went back to compressions. His arms felt like wet noodles. He was shivering so hard he could barely keep his rhythm. Crack. He felt a rib give under the force. He didn't stop. Suddenly, the giant body convulsed. The man arched his back and vomited a torrent of river water. He gasped, a ragged, terrible sound, hacking and coughing. "That's it," Caleb whispered, falling back onto his heels. "That's it." The biker groaned, his eyes fluttering open. They were dark, confused. He tried to sit up, but failed. His hand flailed out, grabbing Caleb's wrist. The grip was crushing, even in his weakened state. "Who?" the man rasped. Before Caleb could answer, the world turned blue. Flickering blue lights washed over the concrete walls of the underpass. A siren whooped, short, aggressive bursts. Caleb looked up toward the service road. A police cruiser had pulled up right next to where Caleb had left his backpack. The door opened, and Sergeant Vic stepped out. Caleb's heart stopped. If Vic found him here, with a half-dead biker and a crashed car in the river, he wouldn't see a hero. He would see a suspect. He would see a homeless kid trying to rob a corpse. Vic had promised to throw him in a cell, or worse. Panic, primal and overwhelming, seized Caleb. "I can't be here," Caleb stammered. He pulled his wrist free from the biker's grip. "Wait," the biker groaned, reaching out. "I can't." Caleb scrambled to his feet. He looked at his backpack, lying right next to Vic's boots. He couldn't go back for it. His ID, his money, everything. "Hey," Vic shouted from the ridge, shining his flashlight down. "You! Stop!" Caleb didn't stop. He turned and sprinted into the shadows of the old rail yard, vanishing into the dark, rain-soaked labyrinth of the city. Down on the riverbank, Tank lay gasping for air. He watched the kid run. He looked at his hand, still feeling the phantom grip of the boy's bony wrist. He looked up at the cop standing on the ridge. The cop kicked the soggy canvas backpack, sneering, then picked it up. Tank narrowed his eyes. He didn't know who the kid was, but he knew one thing. The boy had the heart of a lion, and he had left something behind. 24 hours later, the ICU at St. Jude's Hospital was quieter than a church, except for the room at the end of the hall. That room was guarded by two men who looked like they chewed gravel for breakfast. They wore leather vests with the death's head patch. They stood with arms crossed, staring down anyone who walked by. Inside, Tank sat upright in the bed. He was hooked up to monitors, his chest wrapped in bandages, but he looked ready to fight a war. The room was filled with men, the Hells Angels of the downtown charter. "The SUV driver?" Tank asked, his voice sounding like two stones grinding together. "Dead," said a man named Rooker, the charter president. Rooker was older, with gray hair tied back and eyes that missed nothing. "Cops fished him out this morning. Rival dealer. Panicked when he saw you." "And the kid?" Tank asked. The room went silent. "We couldn't find him, Tank," Rooker said. "Vic, the cop who called it in, said nobody was there when he arrived. Said you must have hallucinated him." "I didn't hallucinate," Tank growled. He shifted, wincing as his broken rib protested. "He pulled me out. Me. 280 plus gear. He was a twig, Rooker. A damn twig, shaking like a leaf." "But he didn't quit." Tank pointed to the bedside table. On it sat a soggy, mud-stained canvas backpack. "Vic tried to book this into evidence as trash found at scene," Tank said, his anger rising. "I made one of the prospects snatch it from the precinct before they tossed it." Tank reached over and unzipped the bag. He dumped the contents onto the sterile white sheet. Wet socks, a wrapper, and a laminated card. Tank picked up the ID. He stared at the photo. A young face, unsmiling, eyes guarded. "Caleb Miller," Tank read aloud. "Age 20. No address." "Homeless," Rooker noted. "He saved my life, Prez," Tank said, looking up. The intensity in his eyes made the other men shift. "He dove into the Hudson in November. He saved a brother, and then he ran because he was terrified of that cop." Tank handed the ID to Rooker. "That water is poison. If he swallowed any, or if the cold got him, he's out there dying, Rooker. Alone." Rooker looked at the ID, then at his sergeant-at-arms. He nodded slowly. "This isn't a cold case," Rooker announced, his voice filling the room. "This is a debt. A life debt." Rooker turned to the men. "Call the other charters. Queens, Brooklyn, Long Island. I want every prospect, every hangaround, and every patch holder on the street. We aren't looking for a snitch. We aren't looking for a rival." Rooker held up the ID. "We are looking for the River King. Find him, before the sickness takes him, or before Sergeant Vic does." Caleb was burning. He was lying on a pile of discarded insulation in the corner of a condemned warehouse in the meatpacking district. He had been there for 2 days. The cold of the river had been replaced by a fire that raged inside his chest. Every breath was a jagged shard of glass. He coughed, and the sound was wet and deep. Pneumonia. He knew what it was. He'd seen other street kids die of it. He curled into a ball, shivering violently. His mind was fracturing. In his delirium, The shadows of the warehouse turned into monsters. He saw the black SUV crashing over and over again. He saw the skull patch of the biker. But mostly, he saw Vic. Vic was the boogeyman. In Caleb's fever dream, Vic was 10 feet tall, with fingers like talons, laughing as he tore up Caleb's ID. "You're nothing," Dream Vic whispered. "You don't exist." Caleb whimpered. He was thirsty, so thirsty, but he couldn't move. His limbs felt disconnected from his body. He heard a noise outside, tires on gravel, a car door slamming. Real fear spiked through the fever. "Police!" a voice shouted. "Clear the building!" It wasn't a dream. It was a sweep. Caleb tried to stand, but his legs collapsed. He crawled toward a gap in the wall, dragging himself through dust and rat droppings. He had to hide. Heavy footsteps echoed in the vast, empty space. Flashlights cut through the gloom. "Over here, Sarge. Found a nest." "Clear it out," a familiar voice commanded. Caleb froze. It was Vic. Of all the cops in the city, of all the warehouses, fate had brought the vulture here. Or maybe Vic had been hunting him. Caleb squeezed himself behind a rusted industrial boiler, holding his breath, tears streaming down his hot, grime-streaked face. Sergeant Vic kicked the pile of insulation. He saw the protein bar wrapper. He saw the shape of a body imprinted in the dust. "He's here," Vic said, a cruel smile touching his lips. "I can smell him." Vic motioned for the two rookies with him to check the upper level. He wanted this one for himself. Vic hated the homeless. He hated their weakness. He hated the way they cluttered his city. But he hated Caleb Miller specifically because Caleb had escaped him at the river. Vic didn't like loose ends. Vic walked slowly through the shadows. He saw the boot print near the boiler. He stepped around the rusted metal and shone his light down. Caleb curled tighter, shielding his eyes. "Peekaboo," Vic whispered. Vic reached down and grabbed Caleb by the hoodie, hauling him up. Caleb was dead weight, his head lolling. "Look at you," Vic laughed, shoving Caleb against the brick wall. "You look like death warmed over." "Please," Caleb croaked. "Sick. Hospital." "Hospital," Vic sneered. "Hospitals are for citizens, Miller. You're a squatter. You're trespassing." Vic slammed Caleb against the wall again. Caleb crumpled to the floor, coughing blood. "I saw you at the river," Vic said, crouching down. "I saw you run. What did you steal from that dead biker? Huh?" "Saved him," Caleb gasped. "Saved him?" Vic laughed loudly, the sound echoing off the steel beams. "You? You couldn't save a stray cat. You were robbing the corpse. That's a felony, Miller." Vic stood up and unholstered his baton. He tapped it against his palm. "I'm going to do the city a favor," Vic said. "I'm going to teach you a lesson about running from the police. And then I'm going to dump you in the precinct holding cell until you rot." Vic raised the baton. Caleb closed his eyes, waiting for the pain. He was too weak to fight. He was finally going to disappear. Then the ground began to shake. It started as a vibration in the concrete floor, a low hum that resonated in the chest. Vic paused, baton in the air. "What the hell is that?" The hum grew to a growl. The growl grew to a roar. It wasn't one engine. It was dozens, maybe 100. The sound was apocalyptic. It filled the warehouse, drowning out the rain outside. It was the sound of rolling thunder. Vic lowered the baton and turned toward the large bay doors of the warehouse. The doors, secured by a rusty chain, suddenly bowed inward. Red bark. Next. Next. The chain snapped. The doors flew open. Headlights. A sea of blinding white LED headlights cut through the darkness. illuminating the dust motes in the air like stars. The motorcycles rolled in, 2 by 2, a phalanx of chrome and black steel. Vic took a step back, his hand instinctively going to his gun. "This is a police operation!" he screamed, though his voice wavered. The bikes kept coming. They fanned out, creating a semicircle around Vic and Caleb. 10 bikes, 20, 50. The engines cut simultaneously. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise. One bike rolled forward. It was a massive touring bike. The rider kicked the kickstand down and dismounted. He was huge. He moved stiffly, his chest wrapped under his shirt, his face pale, but his eyes burning with a terrifying intensity. It was Tank. Tank walked past the line of bikes. Behind him, 50 men wearing the red and white dismounted. They stood silently, arms crossed, a wall of leather and denim. Vic swallowed hard. He recognized Tank. He had seen the crash report. "Stay back!" Vic yelled, drawing his service weapon. "I am an officer of the law!" Tank didn't stop. He didn't even look at the gun. He walked straight past Vic as if the cop were a ghost. Tank knelt beside Caleb. He looked at the boy's fever-bright eyes, the blood on his lip, the terrified trembling. Tank gently touched Caleb's shoulder. "You came back," Caleb whispered, his voice barely audible. "I told you," Tank said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't leave my brothers behind." Tank stood up and turned to Vic. Vic was shaking now, the gun trembling in his hand. He looked at the 50 bikers. He realized, with dawning horror, that he was outnumbered, outgunned, and entirely alone. He's a suspect," Vic stammered. "Vagrancy. Theft." Tank took a step toward Vic, then another. He towered over the cop. "You kicked him," Tank said. "It wasn't a question." "He was resisting." "You were going to beat a dying kid with a stick," Tank said. His voice was calm, which made it infinitely more terrifying. "This is police business," Vic shrieked, backing up until he hit a support pillar. Tank leaned in, his face inches from Vic's. "No," Tank rumbled. "You hurt the man who saved my life. You hurt a friend of the Hells Angels. That makes it club business." Tank reached out. He didn't punch Vic. He simply ripped the badge off Vic's uniform shirt. The fabric tore with a loud rip. Vic gasped. "You aren't a cop," Tank said, dropping the badge into the dust. "You're just a bully with a shiny sticker." From the circle of bikers, phones were out, recording. "We have footage of you threatening a minor," Rooker, the president, said from the line. "We have footage of you destroying his property. And we have 50 witnesses who just saw you point a loaded weapon at an unarmed man aiding a medical emergency." Vic lowered the gun. He knew it was over. If he fired, he died. If he didn't, his career was dead. The Angels wouldn't kill him. They would ruin him. They would sue the department, release the footage, and destroy his life legally. "Get out," Tank whispered, "before I forget that I'm a civilized man." Vic holstered his gun. He looked at his badge in the dirt. He didn't pick it up. He scurried past the bikers, head down, a rat fleeing the light. The warehouse felt different now. The menace was gone, replaced by a strange, chaotic warmth. Tank turned back to Caleb. He didn't call an ambulance. The Angels had their own doctors, men who knew how to keep their mouths shut and do the job right. "Can you ride?" Tank asked, smiling gently. Caleb shook his head weakly. "I can't even stand." Tank nodded. He gestured to 2 massive prospects. "Get the chase van. We're taking him home." Tank bent down and picked Caleb up. Caleb weighed nothing in his arms. "Where are we going?" Caleb mumbled, his head resting against the leather vest, right on the patch he had feared so much. "To the clubhouse," Tank said. "You need a hot meal, a warm bed, and about a week of sleep." "I lost my ID," Caleb murmured, his eyes closing. I'm nobody. Tank stopped walking. He looked down at the boy. You're not nobody, kid, Tank said firmly. You're the River King. 2 weeks later. The Hells Angels clubhouse in the East Village was a fortress, but inside, the air smelled of barbecue and old wood. Caleb sat at the long bar. He looked different. The hollow cheeks were filling out. The pneumonia was gone, treated by a private doctor paid for by the club treasury. He wore clean jeans and a fresh black t-shirt. The door opened and Tank walked in. He was off crutches now, though he still moved with a slight limp. He walked up to Caleb and slammed a hand on his shoulder. Ready to go, kid? Tank asked. Go where? Caleb asked. Back to the bridge? The room went quiet. The pool game stopped. The men at the tables turned to look. Tank reached behind the bar and pulled out a broom. He tossed it to Caleb. Caleb caught it, confused. You can't stay here for free forever, Tank grunted, trying to hide a grin. We got floors that need sweeping, bikes that need washing, beer that needs stocking. Tank reached into his vest and pulled out a fresh, stiff denim vest. It had no patches on the back. It was bare, but on the front there was a small tag. It pays minimum wage, Tank said, plus room and board upstairs. If you work hard, if you show respect, and if you keep your nose clean, maybe in a year or two, you trade that broom for a bike. Caleb looked at the broom, then at the vest, then at the circle of scary, scarred, bearded men who were looking at him, not with hatred, but with expectation. For the first time in his life, Caleb wasn't invisible. He wasn't a foster kid. He wasn't a vagrant. He put on the vest. It fit perfectly. I'm not good at sweeping, Caleb said, a small smile breaking through. Tank laughed, clapping him on the back. You'll learn, kid. You'll learn. Caleb looked out the window. It was raining again. But for the first time in years, he wasn't cold. He was home.